The grand auction hall glittered with chandelier light as elegantly dressed buyers sipped champagne from crystal flutes. The air was thick with expensive cologne and the quiet murmurs of wealth. Men in tailored suits and women draped in designer dresses exchanged polite nods, their practiced smiles never quite reaching their eyes. This wasn't just any horse auction, it was the Westbrook Elite Sale, where blue bloods came to purchase perfection. The auctioneer's voice rang out with practiced enthusiasm as magnificent thoroughbreds pranced before the crowd, their coats gleaming like polished silk. Each animal was a testament to careful breeding and meticulous care, their price tags climbing into six figures while manicured hands raised bid paddles with casual indifference. Then the atmosphere shifted. A collective grimace spread across the room as handlers led in the next offering. A pitiful bay mare, whose ribs pressed against her dull, patchy coat like prison bars. Her head hung low, ears pinned back in what might have been shame. The contrast between this creature and the gleaming specimens that came before her couldn't have been more stark. The auctioneer cleared his throat, his voice losing its musical quality, as he struggled to find something positive to say. Starting bid of $500 for this breeding prospect. Anyone? His words fell flat in the suddenly silent room. A woman in pearls whispered behind her hand, loud enough to be heard. "What a waste of our time." A few rows ahead, a man in an expensive hat snickered. "They should have sent that one straight to the glue factory." Laughter rippled through the crowd, cruel and dismissive. The mare flinched at the sound, her body trembling slightly as she shifted her weight, an odd movement that seemed almost protective rather than fearful. In the back row, partially hidden in shadow, Mason Reynolds watched with different eyes. His weathered face remained still beneath his worn canvas hat, his work-roughened hands resting calmly on his knees. Unlike the polished buyers with their catalog notes and investment strategies, Mason studied the mare's body language, the way she positioned herself, the unusual angle of her stance, the alertness in her eyes despite her exhaustion. While others saw worthlessness, Mason noticed purpose in her movements. Every time the handler tried to adjust her position, the mare stubbornly shifted back, maintaining that strange angle toward the wall. Her eyes, though dull with fatigue, darted periodically to her left flank with unmistakable concern. The auctioneer sighed, already reaching for his gavel. "No interest then? We'll move on to lot 43. Mason's quiet voice cut through the dismissive murmurs. Heads turned, searching for the source of the bid, expressions shifting from surprise to amusement when they spotted Mason's threadbare jacket and scuffed boots. The wealthy spectators exchanged knowing glances, some openly chuckling at the out-of-place bidder who clearly didn't belong in their world of pedigrees and prospects. Little did they know what Mason had already seen, what the mare was desperately trying to protect. The auctioneer's gavel hovered in midair, ready to dismiss the wretched mare from the ring when Mason's voice rose again, this time louder. 550. His weathered face remained impassive as the crowd turned toward him, expressions shifting from surprise to amusement. A wealthy oil magnate in the front row threw back his head and laughed, the sound echoing through the high-ceilinged hall. The man nudged his companion, gesturing toward Mason with a diamond-studded hand. The poor fool must be blind as well as stupid. The auctioneer hesitated, his practiced smile faltering as he scanned the room for any competing bids. Finding none, he half-heartedly called out once, twice, his voice lacking its earlier enthusiasm. With visible reluctance, he brought down the gavel. "Sold to the gentleman in the back." Whispers rippled through the crowd as Mason stood, his worn boots scuffing against the polished floor. He moved with unhurried confidence through the sea of designer suits and dresses, ignoring the smirks and sideways glances. A woman in an emerald silk dress stepped deliberately away as he passed, as though his shabby clothes might somehow stain her expensive outfit. Others made no attempt to hide their disdain. watching with morbid curiosity as this outsider claimed his worthless prize. The mare shifted nervously as Mason approached, her dull eyes widening with fear. Unlike the other buyers who had strutted around their purchases with proprietary pride, Mason stopped several feet away, his movements slow and deliberate. He stood quietly, letting the mare take in his scent, his presence. Something in his stillness seemed to calm her, though she continued to maintain that strange protective stance. The auction manager approached, clipboard in hand, his expression a mixture of contempt and pity. He tapped his expensive pen against the paper, informing Mason that the horse hadn't passed a proper veterinary inspection. The mare was underweight, possibly diseased, and frankly not worth the trailer space to haul her away. But Mason's attention never wavered from the horse as the manager spoke, his weathered hands signing the paperwork without looking down. A group of men in custom boots and belt buckles the size of dinner plates gathered nearby, making no effort to lower their voices as they placed bets on how long before the worthless nag collapsed. One suggested Mason was buying cheap meat for dog food, causing fresh laughter to erupt, yet Mason remained unmoved, his focus entirely on the mare whose eyes now watched him with something beyond fear, something that looked almost like desperate hope. When the payment was complete, Mason approached the mare with measured steps, speaking in a voice too low for others to hear. The horse's ears, which had been pinned back in distress, slowly swiveled forward, her nostrils flared, taking in his scent. As Mason extended his hand, palm up and open, the auction crowd fell silent, watching this strange tableau with reluctant fascination. The connection forming between man and horse was palpable, a quiet understanding passing between them that made some of the onlookers shift uncomfortably, suddenly feeling like intruders witnessing something private and profound that money could never buy. The setting sun cast long shadows across the auction grounds as Mason led the mare toward his modest trailer. The crowd had dispersed, wealthy buyers speeding away in luxury vehicles with their gleaming purchases, leaving behind only the scent of expensive perfume and disdain. The mare moved with painful slowness, her hooves dragging against the gravel, yet she maintained that same protective angle with her body, constantly shifting to keep her left flank turned away from Mason, despite his gentle guidance. Mason didn't force her to walk straight, recognizing the deliberate nature of her movements. Years of working with abused horses had taught him patience, had taught him to listen to what animals couldn't say with words, and this mare was telling him something important with every careful step she took. The loading ramp creaked under their weight as Mason coaxed the mare forward. She balked at the trailer entrance, her thin body trembling with exhaustion or fear, perhaps both. Mason waited, giving her time. The mare's eyes darted repeatedly toward the gathering darkness behind them, then back to the trailer, as if making an impossible calculation. Her nostrils flared wide, breathing in the scents of old hay and worn leather from Mason's well-used trailer. With a soft, nickering sound deep in her throat, the mare finally stepped into the trailer, but instead of moving forward to the feeding trough where fresh hay waited, she immediately turned, positioning herself sideways across the entrance. Her body blocked the way, her stance wider now, more deliberate. Mason stood perfectly still, watching as the mare's eyes fixed on something in the shadows beyond the ramp. A sound broke the silence, so faint it might have been the evening breeze rustling through nearby trees. But Mason knew better. It was the softest whicker, a sound horses make to call their young. The mare responded with a low rumble in her chest, her ears pricked forward with intense focus. Mason stepped back off the ramp, scanning the deepening shadows. There, barely visible against the darkening ground, stood a foal. The tiny creature was little more than a skeleton, with skin stretched too tight across protruding bones. Its spindly legs trembled violently, hardly able to support even its minimal weight. The foal's dull coat, matted and rough, couldn't hide the sharp angles of its hip bones and ribs. Understanding dawned across Mason's weathered face. This was what the mare had been protecting, not herself, but her baby. Throughout the auction, surrounded by strangers and danger, she had positioned herself to hide the foal from view, keeping its existence secret. Her strange movements, her resistance to handlers adjusting her position, all to keep her baby safe from the eyes that had judged her worthless. The tiny foal took one wobbling step toward its mother, then another, each movement a monumental effort. Mason remained motionless, his heart tight in his chest as he watched the weak creature struggle up the ramp. The mare's eyes never left her baby, encouraging it with soft sounds that carried on the evening air. Under the dim light of the trailer, the full extent of the foal's condition became clear. It couldn't be more than a few weeks old, yet malnutrition had already left its mark. The mare had been sacrificing what little strength she had, giving everything to keep her baby alive while she herself wasted away. Mason took a slow, deep breath. What he'd thought was a simple rescue had just become something far more complicated and far more important. He wasn't saving one life tonight, but two. The old truck labored up the winding gravel road, its engine groaning under the strain of the trailer's weight. Mason's eyes darted frequently to the rearview mirror, checking on his precious cargo with each bump and turn. The journey stretched longer than usual, his normally steady hands gripping the wheel with unusual tension. These weren't just animals he was transporting. They were survivors balancing on the knife edge between life and death. Dawn was breaking as Mason's modest ranch came into view, the first golden rays of sunlight touching the weathered sign that read Second Chance Farm. The name wasn't fancy, but it was honest, just like everything else about this place. The barn stood solid and practical, surrounded by green pastures sectioned off with sturdy fencing. No luxuries here, nothing like the opulent stables owned by those auction goers. But something far more valuable filled this space: hope. Mason eased the trailer as close to the barn as possible before cutting the engine. The silence that followed seemed sacred somehow, a moment of transition. Inside his barn, the tools of his former life as a veterinarian hung neatly on the walls alongside simple ranch equipment. Gleaming stethoscopes and surgical instruments shared space with curry combs and hoof picks, remnants of the prestigious practice he'd walked away from 5 years ago, when he could no longer stomach treating only pampered show horses, while the broken ones were discarded. The mare nickered softly as Mason lowered the trailer ramp, her exhausted body still positioned protectively in front of her foal. With gentle movements born from years of handling frightened animals, Mason coaxed them both into the barn's largest stall, freshly bedded with clean straw. The mare's ribs pressed sharply against her dull coat as she struggled to remain standing, her strength nearly spent after safeguarding her baby through the night's journey. Working methodically, Mason prepared a special mixture of warm mash with electrolytes and essential nutrients, just enough to begin their rehabilitation without overwhelming their weakened systems. His medical training guided each decision, calculating medications and feed with the precision that had once made him one of the most sought-after equine veterinarians in 3 counties. The mare watched his every movement with wary eyes, her body tensing whenever he approached the foal. When Mason attempted to check the baby's vital signs, she placed herself between them, ears pinned back in warning. Despite her debilitated state, her maternal instinct remained fiercer than her fear or exhaustion, a testament to her character that Mason respected even as it complicated his efforts to help. Throughout that first day, Mason worked nearby, allowing them to grow accustomed to his presence. He spoke in low, gentle tones, explaining his intentions as he measured medication and prepared special feeds. The foal's condition was precarious, its tiny body severely dehydrated and malnourished. The mare wasn't much better, having sacrificed her own health for her baby's survival. As darkness fell across the farm, Mason settled onto a bale of hay outside their stall, a medical journal open on his lap, but his attention fixed on his new patients. The mare stood guard over her sleeping foal, her posture softening slightly in the safety of the clean stall, though her eyes still tracked Mason's every move. In her gaze, beyond the fear and exhaustion, Mason recognized something that made all the mockery at the auction fade into meaninglessness. There was fight in those eyes, a determination that no amount of cruelty had managed to extinguish. The gentle rhythm of days at Second Chance Farm followed the rising and setting sun, each one bringing small victories in the quiet battle for survival. Mason spent hours in the stall, with the mare and foal, his movements consistently slow, his voice a steady murmur like rainfall on a tin roof. Patience had become his greatest tool, more valuable than any medical instrument hanging on his barn wall. The foal recovered, with the resilience of youth, its spindly legs growing steadier with each passing day. Its coat began to shine under Mason's careful grooming, dull patches giving way to the sleek gleam of good health. Each morning, the little one greeted Mason with more energy, prancing around the stall with increasing confidence while its mother watched with cautious eyes. The mare's recovery moved at a more reluctant pace. Her body, depleted from protecting her foal against impossible odds, required time to rebuild what neglect had stolen. She accepted Mason's offerings of specialized feed and medicines, but maintained a careful distance. Her trust extended just far enough to allow his care but no further. 3 weeks into their rehabilitation, Mason noticed something as he brushed the mare's flank. Beneath the overgrown winter coat, his fingers felt the raised pattern of an old brand. Working carefully with the brush, he slowly revealed what had been hidden. An intricate mark in the shape of 2 interlocking B's, surrounded by a horseshoe. Mason's hand stilled, recognition flickering across his weathered face. Blackwood Stables. The name carried weight in racing circles, a breeding operation whose bloodlines had produced winners across the country. Their horses regularly sold for 6 figures, their training methods legendary, their reputation pristine. The discovery of their mark on this abandoned mare raised questions that tugged at Mason's mind like a splinter that couldn't be ignored. That evening, Mason sat on his porch, thumbing through old racing journals kept from his veterinary days. The mare's age, conformation, and distinctive markings pointed to a possibility that seemed increasingly certain. She wasn't just any Blackwood horse mess. Records suggested she was Eclipse's shadow, a mare whose promising career had been cut short by injury 3 years ago. The racing world had assumed she'd been retired to Blackwood's breeding program, her value as a broodmare secured by her impressive lineage. Instead, she had somehow ended up neglected, pregnant, and abandoned at a rural auction, her identity erased by neglect and malnutrition. The prestigious stable had some explaining to do. Inside the barn, the mare's health continued its slow improvement, but her spirit began to revive more quickly. One morning, instead of retreating when Mason entered with breakfast, she remained by the feed bucket, her ears forward with tentative curiosity rather than pinned back in fear. The following day, she allowed his hand to rest briefly on her neck without flinching. Small steps, but meaningful ones. The foal, growing bolder by the day, began seeking out Mason's attention, nosing at his pockets for treats, leaning into his gentle scratches. Its mother watched these interactions with visible tension at first, ready to intervene, but gradually, witnessing Mason's consistent gentleness, her vigilance began to ease. On the 30th morning, when Mason entered the stall, something shifted. The mare didn't back away. Instead, she took a step forward, her soft muzzle reaching out to touch his outstretched hand, the first contact she had initiated. In that moment of connection, Mason felt the weight of her story and silently renewed his promise to uncover the truth of how Blackwood's prized mare had fallen so far from grace. The truth unraveled slowly, like a thread pulled from an old tapestry. Mason's phone calls to former colleagues in the racing industry were met first with disbelief, then hushed concern. Eclipse's shadow, known on the track as Midnight Miracle, had not simply been retired as the official story claimed. The mare whose speed and heart had captured imaginations hadn't peacefully transitioned to a breeding career at Blackwood Stables. Instead, a darker reality emerged with each conversation and document Mason uncovered. The injury that ended her racing days had been deemed treatable, but expensive. Blackwood's owner, Harrison Reed, had calculated her worth against the cost of rehabilitation and made a cold decision. Rather than investing in her recovery and facing questions about their training practices, Blackwood had quietly sold her to a middleman with instructions to move her far from the racing circuit. No paperwork traced her journey after that, her prestigious name and lineage deliberately erased. Mason pieced together her path through a series of owners, each caring less than the last. Her value diminished with each sale, from celebrated champion to broodmare, from broodmare to workhorse, and finally to the emaciated creature standing forgotten in an auction ring. Somewhere along that descent, she had become pregnant, the foal's sire unknown, but clearly of quality bloodlines based on the colt's improving conformation. The racing publication's Mason contacted reacted with growing interest. A journalist arrived at Second Chance Farm, camera in hand, eager to document the remarkable story of Midnight Miracle's resurrection. When the article ran, complete with before and after photographs, the phone began ringing with a persistence that matched the knocking at Mason's front door. The first visitor arrived in a gleaming black SUV, the same oil magnate who had laughed the loudest at the auction. His custom boots now stood uncertainly on Mason's worn porch boards, as he offered a figure that would have bought the entire farm twice over. His smile never reached his eyes, as he explained his sudden interest in the mare's welfare, how his daughter was such an admirer of Midnight Miracle's legacy. Mason watched him shift uncomfortably under the mare's steady gaze when they visited the barn, noted how the man avoided looking at the foal entirely. More came in the following days. Blackwood's representative arrived with lawyers and documents, claiming ownership rights had never been properly transferred. A wealthy collector offered to make Mason's financial troubles disappear. Troubles Mason wasn't aware he had until the man invented them. A breeding operation promised the mare would want for nothing, though they showed little interest in the colt at her side. Each visitor spoke of the mare's value, her bloodlines, her potential for breeding more champions. None mentioned her spirit, her fierce protection of her foal, or the trust so painfully built over weeks of patient care. None asked about her preferences, or recognized the intelligence in those eyes that had seen the worst of humanity, yet somehow retained the capacity for trust. Each time, Mason walked them to their cars with the same quiet response. She wasn't for sale at any price. The mare that had been discarded like trash when she no longer served their purposes wasn't leaving Second Chance Farm. The visitors departed, some angry, some baffled by this stubborn man who couldn't recognize an opportunity when it pounded on his door. That evening, as the sun painted the horizon in fiery streaks, Mason sat on a bale of hay watching Midnight Miracle and her colt share a peaceful moment together. The prestigious name fit her once again, but for entirely different reasons than those that had first earned it. 3 months transformed Midnight Miracle beyond recognition. Her once protruding ribs disappeared beneath a sleek coat that gleamed like polished onyx in the summer sun. Her eyes, once dull with desperation, now sparkled with vitality as she cantered gracefully across the pasture, head high and tail flowing like a banner behind her. The mare's recovery revealed what neglect had hidden, the exquisite conformation and presence that had once made hearts stop at racetracks across the country. Her foal's transformation proved even more remarkable. Growing stronger each day, the colt displayed the unmistakable traits of exceptional breeding. His legs, once spindly and weak, now showed the perfect proportions that promised both speed and endurance. But more striking than his physical development was his spirit, fearless and curious, with an intelligence that sometimes left Mason shaking his head in wonder. The colt would race along the fence line, his movements displaying an instinctive understanding of pace and balance that couldn't be taught. Word of their recovery spread beyond the racing publications. A popular wildlife documentary team arrived to film their story, capturing footage of the colt's playful bursts of speed and his mother's watchful grace. When the segment aired nationally, Second Chance Farm's quiet existence ended overnight. The footage of Midnight Miracle's transformation from the auction house skeleton to the gleaming, powerful mare she had become created a sensation. Among the flood of visitors were familiar faces, auction-goers whose laughter had once filled the hall at Mason's expense. They arrived with forced smiles and convenient amnesia about their previous mockery, exclaiming over the horses as if they had always recognized their value. Mason received them with the same quiet courtesy he showed everyone, neither reminding them of their cruelty nor accepting their revised versions of that night. The oil magnate who had placed bets on how quickly the mare would die now stood slack-jawed at the fence, watching her power around the pasture with her colt at her heels. The woman in the emerald dress who had stepped away from Mason in disgust now offered compliments in a honeyed voice, as if they were old friends sharing a triumph. Mason accepted their words with a nod, neither welcoming nor rejecting their attempts to rewrite history. Then came the envelope, heavy cream paper, bearing the embossed crest of the Royal Equestrian Exposition, the most prestigious horse event in the country. Inside lay an invitation for Midnight Miracle and her colt to appear as honored guests, their story to be celebrated in the same arena where champions were crowned. The irony wasn't lost on Mason. The event was chaired by the very people who had dismissed the mare as worthless only months before. For 3 days, Mason left the invitation on his kitchen table, considering its implications. The exposition would bring attention to the plight of discarded racehorses, potentially helping others like Midnight Miracle. Yet something about parading her before the same eyes that had once judged her worthless felt wrong. The decision wasn't his alone to make. On the 4th morning, Mason brought the invitation to the pasture, where Midnight Miracle grazed peacefully. The mare approached when he called, her steps confident, her head carried with the dignity she'd never lost, despite everything. The trust in her eyes as she nudged his shoulder made the decision clear. This wasn't about vindication or proving critics wrong. This was about completing a journey, about showing the world that value isn't determined by usefulness, but by an inherent worth no amount of neglect could erase. The Royal Equestrian Exposition gleamed with polished brass and old money, chandeliers casting golden light over the arena, where champions had been crowned for generations. Mason's weathered truck and simple trailer looked out of place among the custom rigs with their chrome fittings and designer logos. Yet what emerged from that humble transport silenced every whisper and stilled every movement in the crowded venue. Midnight Miracle stepped onto the pristine arena footing with the regal bearing of a queen returning to her throne. Her coat caught the light like burnished metal, muscles rippling beneath the surface with each perfectly measured step. At her side pranced her colt, no longer the fragile creature fighting for survival, but a vision of equine perfection, his movements fluid and confident beyond his months. The transformation was so complete that several onlookers checked their programs, unable to believe these magnificent animals were the same pitiful pair from the auction house story. The announcer's voice echoed through the arena, recounting their journey as Mason led them in a simple circle. The same wealthy spectators who had once laughed now leaned forward in the premium seats, their expressions a mixture of awe and discomfort. Recognition dawned on many faces. The oil magnate who had placed cruel bets, the woman in emerald who had recoiled from Mason's presence, the auctioneer who had been ready to dismiss the mare without a second thought. They watched now with the uncomfortable awareness that they had utterly failed to see the value standing before them months ago. After the presentation, Harrison Reed himself approached Mason, surrounded by an entourage of assistants and lawyers. Blackwood Stable's owner carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to acquiring whatever he desired. The figure he named for the mare and foal would have set Mason up for life, would have funded Second Chance Farm for decades to come. When Mason declined with a simple shake of his head, Reed doubled the offer, his smile tightening at the edges. Mason's refusal wasn't about money or pride. It was about something that Reed, for all his wealth and power, couldn't seem to comprehend: that some bonds transcend transaction, that some debts can only be repaid through loyalty. The mare who had fought so hard to protect her foal, who had sacrificed her body and nearly her life, deserved more than to be treated as a commodity, once again, valued only when her worth became obvious to everyone else. The exposition ended, but the story of Midnight Miracle and her colt spread far beyond the equestrian world. Second Chance Farm received donations and support that allowed Mason to expand his work, taking in more discarded horses whose value others had failed to see. Some came from the very people who had witnessed the mare's transformation, their perspectives forever altered by what they had seen. On a golden autumn afternoon, Mason leaned against the fence of his largest pasture, watching Midnight Miracle and her growing colt race across the open ground, their movements synchronized in perfect harmony. They ran not for human entertainment or profit, but for the pure joy of freedom, a joy they had earned through suffering and survival. In their powerful strides was a lesson about resilience, about the hidden worth within creatures others discard, and about the transformative power of seeing value where others see only brokenness. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible tales of rescue and redemption. Your support helps us continue sharing these powerful stories of hope and second chances. Thank you for watching, and I'll hope to see you in the next video.